Good morning, Revolution, everybody, and welcome to our stream. Very happy to see Lisa. Good morning, Lisa. Back at school, and Anita
Yep.
and Scott with us. This morning, we're going to address the issue of whether or not there is a crisis among men, a crisis in masculinity, a crisis in gender roles. I'm not even sure we're talking about this using the right terms, but we'll dig into that as we go, including this recent shooting in Georgia. Um, I mean, I don't know. Right at the beginning of the school year, first week of school, 2 people killed, several wounded, a 14-year-old with an AR-15 type automatic weapon. I think there were 40-some people this year already killed in mass shootings. But we'll come back to that hopefully by the end of the show. Anita, this is a topic top of mind to you. Is there a crisis of masculinity in this country? And if so, how is it reflected?
Well, I don't think there's a crisis of masculinity. Actually, I think when we look at the divide between the genders, I think we do see more men, I guess, moving rightward, for example, which is a very bad sign. But I think our analysis in our party and in our point of view is always that the ruling class is trying to divide the working class. And I think you can really see that very clearly in the way the parties, the political parties, the main political parties, are presenting themselves in this election campaign. And Donald Trump's RNC, Republican National Convention, was all about masculinity and had a very narrow view of masculinity. And of course, his vice presidential pick has said all kinds of horrible things about women, including that they shouldn't have any reproductive rights. So I think there is a more of an effort on the part of the ruling class to put a wedge between women and men. But I think at the same time, the Democratic Party campaign around Kamala Harris has really put forward a different version of masculinity that's not that heteronormative, toxic masculinity of the Republican National Committee or Convention. So I don't think there's a crisis of masculinity. I think women are just taking more and more leadership roles and power, and they're reflected in this election.
And when you say heteronormative, you mean the domination of men, the patriarchy,
Exactly.
and that kind of thing.
Hmm?
Lisa, what do you think? Is there a crisis of masculinity in this country? I mean, is what
I
they were
think
putting forward? Go on.
yeah, go ahead. Sorry, please.
No, go on.
Yeah, I think if we think of a crisis as a change, as a period of change and destabilization of masculinity, there are ways that I would see it as a plethora, a possibility of masculinity in a way that is new. And if you desire, and I think now about Harris's campaign slogan, we're not going back. If you have a desire for entrenched gender roles or the desire that being a man means you automatically have more power and hegemony, then you could see it as a crisis. There's another way for those of us on the left to see it, and I think this is what I see among young people who identify as men, which is also a possibility of masculinity and a plethora of masculinities. And I think that might be at the heart of some of this posturing, that it is about power, it is about questions of economics. But the economics here, and I would agree with Anita, the economics are around division. So if you say this woman took your job, right? And we hear this language around immigration, around race. Then for, let's say, white men or men in general, they can say, it's not capitalism, it's women. And so I think that's where what might be a plethora, a destabilization around what's possible. Like, what does masculinity mean? Let's talk about it. It means many things for different people. And then you couple that with a feeling that my economic insecurity is because of women gaining equality. So I think it's a number of factors that are being capitalized on by the right wing and ultimately towards authoritarian ends.
Wow, Scott, both Lisa and Anita put a lot on the table. Uh, Lisa says that there are varying possibilities in terms of the definition and redefinition of gender roles. What's your take? Is there a crisis of masculinity? And what do we mean by that anyway?
Yeah, I've never been exactly sure because we hear that there's crises of all sorts of things. So there's a crisis of despair among young people. There's a crisis of masculinity. There's a crisis of, the crisis of everyday life for working people. There are various environmental. So we have to think kind of what we mean by crisis, and I don't think it really applies in the case of masculinity. I really like what Lisa said. We're in a moment when the democratic movement, small d democratic, like you say, Joe, the very broad movement for equality, right? For full political and social equality for all people is moving forward. It's making a lot of progress. And that threatens the capitalist class. And so they respond by doubling down on this very old and very entrenched idea of masculinity as domination, masculinity as power over women, masculinity as sort of associated with physical violence very often. And so what's in crisis is that right wing view of masculinity. And in fact, as Lisa said, there are so many possibilities for redefinition of what it means to be a man, and for exploration of what it actually means to be a human. Because one of the things that capitalism does is fragments us in all sorts of ways and tries to pin us into certain positions. So if we think about um, one of the ways that it works, kind of on the economic level, is this push for men to kind of, wreck themselves working, work as much overtime as possible, kill yourself on the job, while women are pushed into that role of domestic work and child rearing, often in addition to paid work. And so that's not a natural separation, right? We're all human beings. We all want to care for our kids. We all, many of us also want to work outside the home, right? So we're there's an era of possibility, and the right wing is standing in its way.
Okay, but look, comrades, the reality is that the economic landscape has shifted dramatically, and that's not new. I mean, after World War II, women have moved into the workforce now, something like 51, 50 to 52% of women work. My mother was one. I grew up in a family where, my dad saw himself as the main and only breadwinner for a while. My mom had to fight in order to get her driver's license and get a job. She ended up as a school librarian after going back to college and getting her degree. Dad wasn't too happy about that, but he had to accept it. And most men have had to accept it. This is not a new thing. And by the way, Anita, one of the articles I read recently done by New York Times journalist said that she was talking to men who were supporting Trump. She said that, these men were not, and she was focusing on Gen X, Gen Z men. She said that these men, most of them, and it's a little bit anecdotal, so we have to take that into account. She said that most of them were supportive of abortion rights, and that the thing that was of concern to them was their ability to support their families, And during the Little Red Schoolhouse, we did a class on the economic and social conditions of Gen Z, and the most important at the top of the list was the issue of the economy. Doesn't that suggest that something else is at work here? That there are men who may be confused about their presidential choices, but that they're not necessarily against women's reproductive rights or other, social issues, and yet they're being pulled in another direction based on economic questions. What do you think?
Well, I think that's an explanatory factor that would explain a lot of the variance of that difference between men and women and their support of the right wing or Donald Trump's campaign in particular. I know young people, Gen Z in general, is really suffering from the economic conditions in which they find themselves. They cannot even think about affording to buy a house, for example, or they can barely afford rent because rents have gone up so high, and they really there may be jobs out there to be had, but the wages are not really enough to live comfortably on. And these young men and young women too, they don't see a way out. They're also paying off student loans often. So they're in very dire economic situations, and they're getting bombarded by misinformation about the economy and who's responsible for the economy and what's responsible. Even in Ohio, we have people talking about blaming the price of bread on Sherrod Brown, our senator, who has nothing to do with the price of bread. So it's the economic situation is very dire for these young people, and this is people born in the late 90s to early 2000s, I guess, and they're really at the beginning of their careers. They're suffering economically, and I think that is one big part of why this segment of young men, and it's not the majority of young men, are open to voting for Donald Trump.
Lisa, I mean, we're Marxists, and this concept of men, we don't define, I have trouble with it because you have to talk about who you're talking about specifically. Are you talking about working class men or men who are, small business owners, or men who are, rich, super rich, the 1%? Are we talking about black men or white men or Latino men or Asian men? Don't we need to interrogate that a little bit more differently? And how does that play into this? Because there's a big shift taking place in gender roles in this country, and how we understand that, particularly amongst Gen Z, with 38% supporting Harris and the Democrats so far, and that's just one indication of it. 13% supporting Trump. There's a 51% gender divide. What's going on here?
Yeah, I also think, I mean, I really like your earlier question around economics. And one of the ways, I mean, as you say, we're Marxists and we have to think about this dialectically. And I think if we ask the question in a more complex way and say that this category that we call men, historically, we've assumed that they are middle class or what we used to call a salary wage. That notion of men, which I think has always been embedded in assumptions of economics and race and nationality, is just not possible. We are aware that there is this huge complexity. I think, though, regarding if we were to ask, like, how do we produce, we on the left, how do we say there are alternatives, right? I agree with Anita. There is nothing in the statistics of the economic possibilities of Gen Z that says this is going to be easy sailing. We've created a system that has your future in mind. All the indicators suggest the opposite. And if we add into that school debt or training debt, whether it's in the trades or it's in colleges and universities or community colleges, we are not taking care of the next generation. In fact, we are saddling them with a yoke of debt that makes it impossible to say, what job would I like to take? Instead, it becomes, how can I pay this debt, the interest accrued on this debt, as well as my basic needs? So I think one of the ways, again, the dialectics of being on the left is we say, what are our alternatives? And I think we're already seeing them, because Gen Z is also probably one of the most pro-union generations we have known. And that desire to say, I will unite with all of the workers at my workplace, I will unite with workers across, say, the service industries. I think this movement is where we on the left say, yes, there's complexity within a category of men. Not all men think the same way. Not all men are acting the same way. That is absolutely true. I think what we're also seeing, again, this is that drive towards equality, is we are all workers and we can demand a future that takes our present into account. We can demand wages that allow us to both eat and pay for rent and keep the electricity on. We demand higher education and training, job training that does not put us into debt for the next 30 years. And all of these things can actually, in our work, create an alternative. So I see the multiplicity of masculinities, the possibility of being someone who is able to express your own weakness, or to be open about hardship, or to lend a hand or a listening, empathetic ear. That's a benefit. That is a life, health, daily benefit. And it is also a non-standard masculinity. It is not in this standard trope. And I think you add that with an economic sort of collectivity against the oppressive relations of the world we find ourselves in, whether it's around rent or around school debt or around low wages or high cost of food. Then we start to build an alternative. Then we start to build an alternative that's healthy, that's happy, that's loving. And that's where, as we talk about masculinity, I also see it, and that gap, I see that as a gap for us to close. Like, I think we can produce a better answer, a happier answer, rather than let's double down on gun violence, let's double down on the oppression of historically oppressed people. Instead, it's like, oh my gosh, equality is way more fun.
Equality is way more fun if we could only experience it. Scott, I want to come back to this issue. I mean, there are the economic questions, and they're very sharp, and they are driving clearly some of this divide in preferences and voting preferences. But there are also democratic issues. I mean, when you take the issue of what was that number? 38% supporting the Democratic candidate now that Harris is in the race, 13% Trump, 51% gender divide. This is amongst Gen Z. I mean, this is a direct consequence of Dobbs, don't you think?
Um, I- it's hard to say direct consequence of Dobbs. Certainly, the Dobbs decision has helped mobilize uh, a movement led by women for reproductive justice. Absolutely. But I kind of want to get back to the earlier question about, is the economics what's driving it? Because so how people perceive their economic situation is also ideological, right? It's shaped by all of these, political discourses that we have absorbed, um, and so what the right has tried to do is push this model of masculinity that makes men feel like makes people who identify as men feel like they should be the primary breadwinners, like you talked about earlier, right? They should have the primary economic responsibility for their family, so that pushes a certain model of where the economy is. And so you see people like Tucker Carlson talking about how the real threat is that men's ability to provide for their families is being threatened by all these higher wage service jobs that are going to women, as Lisa talked about earlier. So there's not a clean divide between economics and democratic questions and political ideology. Um, uh, so I guess that's what I had to say.
I don't know, Scott. I mean, 51% gender divide. I mean, 51%. But I want to come back to this in just a moment. Anita, I'm still having trouble understanding this issue because we're not talking about men in general. African American men, and I don't mean to single anybody out, but African American men are supporting Harris 73%, 13% for Mr. Trump. So aren't we talking about young white men when we talk about Gen Z? And if so, what is going on amongst them that there's such a tremendous statistical difference in voting preferences?
Well, I think we're each going to go back to your question for the previous panelists be here because I want to answer the question you asked Scott, and it sort of answers this question too. And that is that abortion.
Next. I'm sorry,
This is
I
I really think that, I mean, this is the first national election since the Dobbs decision in 22. And I think this group of young women, for them, it's so important to have reproductive rights. This is an age where they really need those that guarantee that they're not going to have to endure an unwanted pregnancy and a forced birth when they're in their very late teens and early 20s. They just cannot afford to do that. And I think that a lot of young people traditionally have been kind of out of the loop in terms of politics. They're not as engaged. They don't have as high a voting rate, for example, among that group of people over years. But this has made it real for young women in particular. Young men can, they can come and go. It's not going to be as important to their own personal life on this decision about abortion rights. So I think that is really driving it. And I think we are talking about young white men, and I think there's also some resentment that has been stirred up, racial resentment, with Donald Trump and his "they're going to take your black jobs" idea. So that the right wing has really tried to capitalize on this. But I do think you're right. It is it's a much bigger gender gap among white people than it is among African Americans and Latinos as well. But there's still a gender gap in those groups as well.
Jim is asking, is it young white men that are really going for Trump? Well, I would have thought this is Jim talking, it would have been white men from 40 to 70. Lisa, you want to take a shot at this? I mean, again, there's a 51% gender divide. Black men are supporting the Democrats by a whopping 77%. What's your take?
Yeah,
Why are
I
we
feel
talking
like
about
it's,
young white men, and then how do we begin to address that issue?
yeah. Well, I think I think you're right. Again, this comes back to something we've talked about earlier, that there's a presumption of who we mean when we mean men. I think that was what you were getting at earlier, and there's a presumption that means white men. So I think the way that we do the statistical analysis, and because of the demographics in the United States, that's what we're talking about when we look at these statistics with that 50% gap. I think that will be changing. And I want to add recent results from a polling firm called Target Smart, which looks at the increase in voter registration. So if we're talking about the elections, this is a slightly different question, but we're asking who is voting. There's been a 175% increase in young Black women who've registered over the last year, 149, almost 150% increase in young Latinas, and that 175% of Black women are young Black women, and it's a 98% increase for Black women overall, 85% increase for Black Americans, and an 83% increase in voter registration of young women. So I think what we have is an energized electorate, and it's an energized electorate in precisely those areas where the attack is strongest. So if you look at the Dobbs, it's attacking all women. It means that women of all races, of all nationalities, and those who are able to bear children are being attacked by the Dobbs decision. They no longer have access to affordable abortion, and in fact, this is all of reproductive health care that's being attacked. And we look at in these, Latinas, Black women, Black men, we are also, and women more generally, we are also talking about the question of racial resentment. And while these are not the same histories and they aren't taking the form of the exact same laws, obviously there's overlap, we are aware of who our coalition partners are at this moment of right-wing attack. Authoritarianism and this talk about make America great again, and that direct response. I just love the brilliance of the Harris slogan of "We're not going back," that there is a hearkening to a racial order as well as a gender order. So Jim Crow and Jane Crow, as Polly Murray would have said, was around a structure of hierarchy. That's what's being hearkened back to, and that's what Harris' campaign is answering. So as we see the electorate change, we are seeing the very people being attacked by the right wing say, absolutely not. I am getting a hold of my vote, and you are going to hear me in in the upcoming elections.
Yes, there is a clear attempt to go back to antebellum days. These neo-Confederate, like Scott likes to call them, neo-Confederate forces. They either want to go back to either before 1930 or at worst before 1865, and that's why some people are arguing that you have a choice in this election between a third Reconstruction and a second edition of the Confederacy. But Scott, coming back to you, the issue, one of the big issues at hand here, we've clearly identified that you can't look at this narrowly. There are many different factors. One of them is the economy. The other are changing gender roles. And within the context of this economy and these changing gender roles, on a program I saw last Saturday on CNN, they put up a list of the Democratic Party platform, right? And on the list all of the different groups that the Democratic Party National Committee was targeting. Harris campaign targeted as well. And they had urban people, they had Black people, they had women, they had rural, they had Latino, they had LGBTQ, they had the environment, they had everybody but their mother and father, except men. And they was and the argument that they were given all of these economic turmoil that young quote unquote men are having, that the problem with is you all are so focused on identity politics that you're not paying attention to the identity of white working class men. How would you respond to that?
That's, you know, it reminds me of all the nonsense about like racism against white people, right? So we talk about special questions, groups of people that face oppression over and above what workers in general face in terms of exploitation and oppression under capitalism. Right? So women, no one is oppressed because they are a man in our society, capitalist society, and patriarchal society. You might be oppressed because you're a working class person who happens to be a man, absolutely. You might be oppressed because of your race or nationality, because of your gender expression, because of your sexuality. But identifying where, which groups are the most heavily targeted by the right and responding to their needs is just democracy, just equality, right? So the solution is not that, we need to elevate the concerns of men, whatever, the crisis of masculinity. It's we need to teach, we need to help people who have fallen under the spell of this ridiculous reactionary idea that men as men are under attack, and help them figure out what the real attack is, what's really responsible for the difficulties they face in their life. Capitalism in the first place, and in fact, misogyny and male supremacy, which harms men both, psychologically and materially, as well as it does women. So the idea that men have somehow been left out is, to my mind, nonsensical. What's been left aside is this, model of hegemonic masculinity, toxic masculinity, this old, right-wing model that props up the capitalist class and perpetuates the exploitation and oppression that all working people face.
And when you say hegemonic, you mean the domination of men.
Yeah.
Hegemony means the domination. Because some of these words, people, they'll be like, huh? What are you talking about? That's a strong point, Lisa. Men are not oppressed in this society. And male supremacy hurts men as well as women. And yet there is this economic crisis that is taking place. And we need to put forward solutions that remedy, that address those crises. And so should the Communist Party put forward in addition to a race and gender-based affirmative action policy, one based on income as well? Would that help solve the problem, in your opinion?
Speak that one out. An affirmative action-based policy on income itself?
No, in addition to race and gender, to use income as a basis for affirmative action. In the California university system, after they reduced or kicked out, got rid of affirmative action, they now employ an income-based program that admits people to the university system based on their income.
Yes. Okay. Yes. And so, as you mentioned, I am in a college, and and this is something that happened in the University of California system, but it also happened really across the board. And we are in a moment of the dismantling of what they, on the right wing, but even within the, the sort of bureaucracy, is called DEI, and that's around equity and the demand that education is for everybody. And I think one of the ways, and here in some ways it was a workaround, where rather than proposing affirmative action on the basis of race, nationality, potentially religion, depending on the college, what their answer was, okay, we'll include income, and there's a language for this. So in my institution, they'll say the first in your family to go to college. Now, as we know, there are positions that don't require you to go to college, and you still have a living wage and a reliable source of income. But it's one of the ways in the higher education that they're talking about class in the university. What we have found that to mean actually is also around a greater multiracial population in the schools. It also changes the way classes are taught for the better. Again, as we were talking about, like, we're always assuming, like, at the center of a generic category like man or a generic category like student, we are often assuming things like that they are white, or that they are middle class, or that they are a man. I think what happens when we have, I think the way you're phrasing it is an affirmative action around class, around income, what we have then is it produces all these other multiplicities. So I think it's something that has been happening for a while, that we're measuring first to college in their family. I think it becomes a badge of pride, because one of the languages on the right wing is that we don't deserve what we get. Somehow we're given it. And this is coming up in the presidential election, that somehow Kamala Harris does not deserve to be a presidential candidate. And I think what happens is actually, as we know, is the reverse. Those who are able to face the steep odds against them, whether it's running for president, going to college, getting the job of their dreams, or being able to pay for rent, or be a sort of individual as an adult. And these are things that are what we call affirmative action, in fact, is a celebration. It's a celebration of the capacity and the drive and the hard work and the collectivity. And that's really important. This isn't about the individual. This is the collectivity that makes that possible. So I would say absolutely. If we continue in all places, across our workplaces, across the opportunities and resources, to keep an eye on issues of class, I think, again, it could build a solidarity across class differences within our working class, and say, actually, my boat being lifted is intimately connected to a recent immigrant coming from south of the border. Their well-being is linked to my well-being, and making that material, building those coalitions, that is a real alternative.
Anita started off talking about the divisiveness of the ruling class attempts to divide our people in our class by gender, by race, and so on and so forth. And certainly that is, and she was right, that was what the GOP convention was all about, with Hulk Hogan and them cats ripping off their shirt like that's, I don't know. Yeah, exactly. Hulk, that whole kind of, I was going to do it, Scott, but you did it better than me. But the role of the party has to be to find avenues for uniting the class. And our standpoint has always been that working class people, whether they be black, white, Asian, or Latino, Arab, Jewish, whatever, have more in common than divides us. At the same time, we face, as different groupings living under capitalism, different sources of oppression. Women oppressed because they are women, black women because they are black and women, Latino women because they're black, some of them, and Latino and women because they speak a different language, and so on and so forth. Um, and and across the class, there are all of us are catching hell, and so therefore we need to put forward special compensatory measures. In other words, what we call affirmative action for people of color, for women, and also from white working class people who come from economically, well, almost, it goes without saying, if you're working class, you come from an economically deprived background, so that we would begin to pull forward proposals that would unite, and as Lisa pointed out, uplift the entire class. Well, I think that does it for us today. It's an interesting topic. We'll continue to explore it and debate it. Main takeaway is that men in this country are not oppressed as men, but they are, working class men are oppressed under capitalism. And we have to seek unity with our working class sisters and other genders in the common fight against big capital. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back next week with another edition of Good Morning Revolution. Until then, stay safe, stay strong, and stay in the fight. Take care.